All right, thanks everybody for coming. Appreciate it. We're gonna start the meeting. If we could please have a roll call.
Trustee Rubin. Here. Trustee Hallwax. Here. Trustee Mealopoulos is absent, but we have a quorum.
All righty. So, first part of the meeting, first item on the agenda is public comments. Anybody want us to say anything? Now's the time. Hearing none, we'll move on. Consideration of the minutes comes next. If I could get a motion. I'll second it. Comments, hearing none. All those in favor?
Aye.
Minutes? Aye. All right, meeting passed, and that brings us to the meat of the meeting.
Okay,
Please, tell us.
so this evening's agenda, let's go through the July treasurer's report, our normal CIP updates. And we will be talking about financial policies, which believe it or not, we are kicking off the calendar year 2025 budget process already. Okay, so starting with the general fund. Property taxes are running more than prior year by just shy of $2 million. We're at 81% of budget. This is as expected. As we discussed last month, the county is actually on time with second installment bills. This is a great news story for us. We've received a large share of revenue from the second installment bill this month, and we're continuing to see receipts roll in August, which is very good and much better than last year. Sales taxes continue to be less than prior year and monthly budget. This month's receipt represents sales for April. We're running about 66.2% of budget. I wouldn't be super concerned about this yet. We still have holiday sales that will come later this year, but we are definitely seeing a difference between last year and this year because we had several non-recurring sales that happened in 23 that will happen in 24. And we are seeing a legitimate decline in some of the auto sales as well. So would still expect that to be a little low. Revenues that were received higher than last year and monthly budget. Places for eating tax continues to perform strong, as do income taxes. Parking fees as evidenced by our ongoing parking conversations. Vehicle licenses and E911 surcharge revenue. Our expenditures are running higher than last year, but we're only at 52% of budget. This is largely due to some of the timing of capital projects that will be kicking off. Either are ongoing and we haven't received invoices for them yet, or they'll be kicking off this fall. In the water fund, rainfall is unfortunately hurting us compared to last year, which was a much drier summer. We are seeing our volumetric revenue running less than last year. It's down by about 133,000. We still have quite a bit of summer usage left to be billed, so not a reason to panic at this point, but we're only at about 41% of budget. Our fixed charge revenue running higher than last year by about $16,000. That's running just shy of 58% of budget. And our similar story to the general fund, our expenditures are less than this time last year, running at about 43% of budget. 1.3 million less than last year. Again, that's due to the timing of capital projects. We do expect expenditures to pick up in the water fund very soon, considering we have the approval of the water main project on the agenda later this evening.
Before we move on from that, our water fund revenues essentially on target for this time of year, even though the revenue because of the rain.
They're
is
running
down.
a little low.
Okay.
I would say fixed charge revenue is on target. The volumetric revenue is running. Okay, and I'm going to turn this over to Stella to talk about the document.
Despite the rainfall, we had 14 days in July with above max capacity that helped offset 5 days part time only and 3 days of walking only. So we had a lot of rain, but when we didn't have rain, we were packed. So it turned out to be a good month for revenues and grounds. We did have quite a few special events and clinics during the month. We had our Play for Pink events, which is a breast cancer research fundraiser that we helped the ladies lead with, and they raised over $7,000 for that. Our clinics for juniors, adults, and high schools took place, and Twilight League was also happening, so July is a pretty busy month. Clubhouse update, we did have a 90% page term review. We are almost at 100% on construction documents, and we're working on negotiations with the Cook County Forest Preserve and the site plan. That's it.
How, if we are forced to revise the plan to fit within the original footprint, will that wind up costing us more, less, or about the same? Is there an estimate?
That's what we're exploring right now. We have the engineers checking into if that's even feasible, and we will get an answer on Monday.
Yeah. There are a few questions that have to be answered as it relates to that still, but yeah, as Stella said, we're still working through that. I would say we're hopeful that it's the last option, that it's basically the same.
And not more.
Yeah.
There's not a whole lot of activity in the debt service fund. We're just aggregating property tax revenues in preparation for our December principal and interest payments. The MFT and capital project funds, those expenditures are increasing in line with what you see in the CIP schedule that we'll be going through shortly. But generally, expenditures are as expected in those two funds. On the personnel side, we're continuing to see the same trend that we've seen all year, that our salaries and benefits are higher than last year, mostly due to filling vacancies. Still on target with what we would expect budgetary wise, but the primary driver of this is public safety. We are seeing an increase year over year in pension costs. Again, that is planned. Some of that is the increase in the pension contribution year over year. Another piece of that is as pension contributions come in, we expense those in the general fund to send them over to the police pension fund. And since the county's on time, we're seeing those expenditures a little bit higher this year than last year because they were delayed last year. Moving on to financial projections. When we look at the general fund, only looking at general fund revenue, we're projecting that the general fund might come in as high as $990,000 over budget. We did receive a one-time grant this year that will be backed out. When we take that out, just to compare actual revenues or projected revenues to budget, you're still expecting a revenue budget surplus of $291,000.
What was the grant for again?
It's the crib wall project with the Park District, the ramp. Yeah. So the reimbursement came, we really finished most of that project last year.
Yeah.
Reimbursement came in this calendar year.
We're so
Fantastic, by the way.
close
Yeah.
to getting the stormwater grant that we started over a year.
I was gonna ask you about that as it relates to that number. So we had received back in,
22 was the
Oh, I think-
project, 20.
right, but I think this before that, Remember that this was the one that John Pate found in the
Yes.
listing. We received a $300,000 grant from Senator Fine's office. We are no longer in Senator Fine's district because of redistricting, but those dollars, I think they were allocated in 2021. And so we just got notification today that the check's in the mail, essentially. So I know what we did was, I think we utilized additional resources out of the capital projects fund to do some more street work. Yes, and so we'll reimburse.
And this will reimburse about $300,000 of stormwater project that we're on.
Right.
So close, so close. Hopefully it'll come.
This was the best email we've gotten from them
Yes.
because they didn't ask for any more data. They just said,
Sure.
we're allocating.
Is how we decide to handle it, what we're reimbursing ourselves for, affect the calculation of you're not using your money, you're not spending your money fast enough, and therefore you have an arbitrage. tax.
That did not, because what we ended up doing is because we knew this grant was committed for us and that it was coming, we reallocated those bond proceeds to the street program
Okay, yeah.
away from the stormwater project, so we actually overspent,
Okay, good.
That's good for
in
everybody.
anticipation of the grants, yes, so.
Okay, nice,
Good
nicely
question.
done, thank you.
Okay, on the water fund side, we're still projecting, I'm optimistic that may come in over budget at the end of the year by about 182,000, relatively modest considering the size of the water fund.
In July were drier months,
Yes.
so it's very possible.
Thinking, right, Costa. We may have a Indian summer. When we add expenditures into that equation, we're looking at the general fund. We're looking at a deficit of 477,000. Just a reminder, if we back out that grant funding, it would be a drawdown of 1.2 million. And just a reminder, we were budgeting a drawdown of 3.1 million. That still might change depending on the timing of capital projects, but that's where we are as of right now, as of today. On the water fund side, projecting a drawdown of 1.3 million, and that was budgeted drawdown of 2 million, so that's a little bit closer. Fund reserves at month end unaudited. The general fund is sitting at 16.2 million, which is about 74% of operating expenditures. Water fund is sitting at 6.6 at 117% of operating expenditures. And just a reminder, the lion's share of that reserve is bond proceeds that we're drawing down last year, this year, and next year. Inflationary impacts. The CPI was announced sub 3 for the first time in a long time. So
I sent her a note
2.9.
with excitement, and she made fun of me.
She was very
That's
excited.
that's very nice, but
Very excited.
big deal. Hasn't happened since 2021.
Big deal.
The market agreed with me.
Yeah.
So 2.9%, certainly a good news story, a good thing to be excited about. And when we look at the budget as a whole, our commodities are still running higher, just year to date, higher than last year, and about 55.7% of budget. We still have quite a bit that we're going to be acquiring later this year, especially as we start getting into snow season. Contractual services also running higher than last year at 46.2% of budget. I'm happy to answer any questions on the treasurer's report.
Somebody like there are anything.
Okay. Moving right along into the CIP update. This is on pages 49 to 51 of the packet. There's one project that was submitted for the village board approval tonight. That's the water main replacement project at Holfelder and Skokie Ridge for $902,000. And then we have 3 projects with adjusted timelines. The Park Avenue outfall moved to September. Green Bay Trail crossing improvements also moved to September, and the traffic signal controller modifications we're hoping to finish in August rather than July. And now into financial policies. Okay, so included in your packet are red line versions of the village's financial policies. I think everyone's been through this before. This is typically our first step in the calendar year budget process, having a discussion about the existing financial policies, which will basically set the tone for the coming year's budget. I will say, spoiler alert, before we get into the discussion, this is kind of a little bit of a mundane discussion. We're not proposing any major changes in any of the policies this year. Really just some cleanup and and some items for discussion. Our fund balance policy, we did change that last year. Still sitting at 25%. Just updated some changes as to what the dollar amount would be there that we would need to stay above. The first item that we really have consideration for, and just an update for you, is that the Illinois Department of Revenue did announce the allowable increase in the property tax levy. And it's at 3.4%. With our initial discussions with the library, they are intending to move forward with that number. Obviously, this is an important consideration as we talk tonight. There is a resolution on the agenda to continue to impose the PTEL cap if home rule passes. So that is incorporated in the policy considerations, just something to keep in mind going forward.
So with pizza, that's actually overall the entire tax, property tax for just the 15.6% that's Glencoe versus District 35 versus New Trier. Do they all have 3.4 or is it just the village?
Everyone has
They're all-
3.4.
And
Yeah.
all four of those entities can do 3.4 or something lower.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yes, good question. So that would not include any increases related to referendum debt. So if there was debt that was passed through the property tax levy, that would be separate and aside from the PTEL limit. So we will be working within the existing policy to prepare a property tax levy estimate. That'll come before the board and we will do a property tax levy hearing in November. And then in December will be the ultimate property tax levy approval. The other item that I wanted to just point out is the property tax abatement. Again, we are recommending the abatement for series 2020A and 2023A. That equates to $514,000 in the coming year. So those are the two bond issues that are outstanding in the water fund. So what we're proposing is when we submit the property tax levy, we will submit a separate ordinance that basically directs the county not to levy for our outstanding water bond issues. And we will instead pay that debt right out of the water fund. So that will not be passed on to the residents. We'll pay that through water service charges. And that's continuing our existing practice. The other item I wanted to mention are just fees in general. Management fees, we'll continue to look at those to see what makes sense in terms of the water fund and the golf club. And we'll be looking at our fee schedule in general, particularly about recovering cost, making sure they're consistent with the village code and that we have everything covered. One thing that we may consider as we get a little further along in the budget process is the use of limited tax debt. Just as a quick refresher, limited tax debt is one of the tools the village has in its pocket to issue without a referendum. Historically, we've used that for infrastructure projects or reserved it for emergency purposes. So that is just another financing tool if something were to come up where we needed to utilize that.
The last time we did that was the streetscape.
True to report.
Yeah, to the court,
And
yeah.
that was a 10-year bond.
2020. Yeah, 2019, you're right, we built in 2020. So we're almost halfway through that.
The limited tax authority is granted to us through state authority. It's calculated by the Illinois Department of Revenue. The authority that we have outstanding as of December 31st, 2023 is just over $5 million. So
Would we do that if we were home rule, or would we just?
you would not need it if you were.
Yeah, it's irrelevant.
Correct.
But
It
that,
might be cheaper for us if it were a home rule issuance as opposed to this.
It could be. Yep,
um,
depending on the length of the bond.
is that 5 what's available, or is it 5 net of what we still have outstanding?
It's net of what we have outstanding and the 5 is net of that.
So we could theoretically.
We could issue
Could
5.
issue
It's,
5.
it's, yeah.
Yes, sorry. There was a better way for me to say that. 5 million is what we have left.
Right.
And that takes
Yes.
the tutor court issue off the top. Okay, and so we do that calculation every year. It's based off of a percentage of EAB. And then to trustee Rubin's point, you do have to take off anything that you have outstanding underneath that authority.
And by the way, the fact that it's still out, we have $5 million that we're not just issuing, we don't have to go to referendum for that. But, oh, we're not going crazy. Just with nonsense. Issuing it as we
Not spending
can.
it to spending.
Right.
We have it.
Might need it.
It's there, it's a tool in the toolbox. Just wanted to point that out. So moving along, we talked about this when the actuary came to the finance committee to present. We did update our funding policy for pensions. Next year's contribution is $3.1 million. It's a 16.3% increase. So a big hit this year.
This is one of the side effects of actually refilling vacant positions in the department. It's to some degree something you anticipate, but you don't know until you get that actuarial assessment as to what that impact will be. But that'll be a unique challenge in developing the budget this year.
And we did talk about this morning, pension board reviewed it, and just as kind of a refresher, we kind of got hit with a triple threat this year. You know, one obviously was filling the vacancies in the public safety department, which is a good thing, and we did know that was going to happen. But also the fact that the market was just a mess last year. So that was a challenge that we were up against. And then we're also continuing to lower that payroll growth assumption in accordance with the policy, and shortening our amortization period. So all of those things lead to kind of escalating the growth in our contribution upfront in an effort to try and level it out over time, and pay down that unfunded liability. So the pension board was supportive of that. We will be preparing a formal report for the pension board to consider in October. That will come before the village board in November as their formal request for you to levy the actuarial required contribution, and that would get rolled into the property tax levy and budget that's approved in December.
In 1 year, I paid 1 year increase, 16.3%.
We added 5
With the 10-year
people.
yield at 4 and the S&P 555.
Yeah, but don't forget, those ups and downs get averaged.
Yeah.
They don't hit plus or.
The biggest
minus.
driver of the pension liability tends to be your interest rates. Interest rates have been high for 3 years now. I don't know what rolling average they use, but it just seemed like it seemed like a big number.
We do continue to use the 6.5% assumption. Which
On return.
on return, which depending on which side of the fence you're on, it could be an aggressive assumption or it could be not high enough. There is a theory that the consolidated fund will earn a higher interest rate. They are still in the process of launching their investment strategy with, I'm sure you know, you're smiling, so you know. When-
You combine a bunch of pools of assets, and it's gonna make more money.
Yes, so when we initially consolidated our pension fund dollars with the state, everything was placed in index funds, just because of the complexity of combining hundreds of funds at once. And now that they've hired an active consultant, they are starting to funnel those investments into different channels. I will say we're looking at it this morning, so it's fresh in my mind. Year to date for the 8 months that we've had, or 7 months we've paid almost $12,000 in investment fees, which is very inexpensive compared to what we were paying at $22,000 a quarter. So I do expect that number to go back up as we continue active management, but I don't expect it to be as high as what we were paying our own. So we are seeing cost savings, which is good. But I would say the largest driver of the pension contribution going up is adding those 5 folks, because percentage wise, that's a large growth in our department, so.
Just something to be thoughtful about as we've had these conversations with respect to home rule. You get some interesting questions from time to time. You and I haven't talked about this, but one was, if the village is successful in a home rule referendum, will we restructure our pension debt I said, well, that's not really how it works. Pension liabilities are not the same as pension debt. And I think there are sometimes all these words sound the same and you get a little bit of word salad. And so it's like, oh, clearly you're levying, so that must mean you have debt that you're repaying. And it's like, no, this is a pay as you go system. That's a worthwhile thing, I think, for us to be mindful of as we talk about liabilities and we talk about how we fund these various component parts of the budget.
We are not selling bonds to pay our pension.
No, I will say there was a time where communities did it and you can't anymore.
Yeah.
And but just high interest rates.
Well, it's crazy.
Yes.
And Nikki and I are both aware of an award-winning program that is no longer possible that took place between two of our neighboring communities where they sold debt and swapped it. And at the time, it was seen as the greatest coup ever, and no longer is it seen that way. So you don't levy debt for your pension liabilities. You just don't do that.
Excuse me, I just want to also clarify that that number, the 3,164,040, is actually higher than the minimum statutorily required number because we are continuing to pay down faster than that, so we can get ahead of it and ultimately hopefully smooth it out and save it gross our residents a lot of money.
And as a reminder, that has been very favorably looked upon by S&P as a reason to continue giving the village a AAA bond rating. So those efforts I think we're in the 4th year of that practice. And that was something we were hearing from the ratings agencies every time we sat. What's your plan? What's your plan? And that was the board. It was very thoughtful in addressing it that way. But your point is well taken. That is more than would be statutorily required.
It's significantly higher.
Yeah.
This year's state calculation is only $2.1 million. So we're now at $1 million differential.
Okay.
And a big share of that differential and contribution is going to pay down that unfunded liability, which ultimately over time will decrease our contributions because we're not paying interest on it. So that is a good point. And one thing I would just note, we are still paying our fire pension contribution on a pay-as-you-go basis.
God bless.
It's gonna be another 20 or 30 years. We keep doing that. Just to keep it alive. And then one other thing I would note, as we get into budget discussions, sources of revenue or sources of funding that we can consider. Our IRMA excess surplus has grown to over $1.8 million. As a reminder to the committee, that is just excess surplus that is at our insurance pool that we use for property, casualty, liability insurance. We can draw upon that if we have a large claim, or we can also, historically, we've used it for safety related items. So there are certainly no shortage of things that we could spend that on, but those are dollars that are available to us to use.
I think one point to make relative to that also is that those dollars have different investment restrictions, and I've been seeing a fairly substantial return, if my memory serves, based off the most recent report from our fund. So that's just a point to make relative to that.
We did receive direction from the committee last year to start drawing that down. So what we did start the last couple of years, we've started using a portion of those reserves to apply towards our annual contribution, which is essentially our premium for the year. So what we have done is used between 250,000 or 250,000 and 300 just to offset that contribution. The contribution depends on our experience and our claim history, but we've been running between 500 and 600,000 a year. So it is a substantial offset to that premium. So that is something that we may consider in the draft budget that's presented to you in November. Similar story with ITBC, our health insurance pool. We also have reserves with them in excess of what's required to be kept there. That could also be used for wellness incentives. So internally, we are evaluating potential uses of those dollars, and that will come before the committee as well. Going through the rest of, we talked about these already.
And all these dollars are bundled into the numbers when we look at our reserve amounts. You know, what do we have in our fund? I should say not reserve, but what do we have in our
Yeah, I would,
general fund?
I don't know that is that true relative to the general fund reserve. I think that is a
I
separate.
think I've taken that out.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
I
We're
think I've
taking
backed
that
that
out
out.
now? Okay.
Mhm.
So I think
Because
it used to
it
be.
created, we
Yeah,
did
okay.
used to include it, and then
And
it
now
seemed
it's-
to create a
now
lot
it's
of
okay.
confusion,
Yeah.
so we did back that out.
At one point, it's come up a couple of times, the state has taken action to stop levying the grocery tax as of January 1 of 26. So it will continue through 25. The Northwest Municipal Conference is doing some research to try to aggregate information about communities that are contemplating whether to reinstate it locally. In taking the action that the state took, they did grant local governments, non-home rule and home rule alike, the ability to levy a 1% grocery tax if they want, 2%, 1%, 1% grocery tax if they so chose to do so. I responded to a survey today that we should have some information as soon as next week. Have a better sense of what at least communities in the region are talking about. As I said, we're not planning to do anything as it relates to this budget, but that may be a future conversation for us to have too. So just something to be aware of.
Right, we don't want to levy the tax here if there's no tax
In
around
Racca,
us.
Highland Park and Northbrook, right?
On the other hand, if everybody's levying the tax, it's easier for us to do so as well.
Which is
'cause it's
why I
essentially
think,
with everybody else.
which is why I think everybody's kind of figure out what everyone else is gonna do about it.
And do something with grocery. Northbrook doesn't.
No, that's my point. That's why everyone's trying to figure out.
It's the same store, but less stuff in it. So. Otherwise, we have people just
As-
head on Shermer Road.
Then that is the point of gathering the data so that you know what your neighbors are doing as opposed to acting alone. That's why I shared that.
The last item I would just note is that we're not recommending any changes to the donation policy, but a policy consideration that we included in there is that as we get closer to hitting the ground running on the golf clubhouse, that any large donations will come, anything naming any of the assets or anything over 25,000 will come before the
Mhm.
finance committee. So.
And to add to that, there is a fledgling not-for-profit foundation that is starting by a few residents to support the public safety department. That effort is, as I said, just in its very formative stages. There are other communities that have very similar foundations typically.
That allows them to do fundraising and events and the golf outing.
Yeah, and then,
It's a 501c3 that supports this,
right.
so it's not technically a bill.
It's not, it's separate from the village, but there would be resources that would be donated to perhaps offset the cost of equipment or something that's necessary or needed for the public safety department. So that is something that is, as it's kind of finding its footing, that we will have more conversations about.
And may need to modify the policy. to
We
include
might,
that.
yeah.
Questions or anything else that you'd like to discuss about any of the policies?
I guess I had one other, that's connected to non-policy stuff, that there's a page like 58 or 9, I just wanted to real quick, was talking about looking at the golf and water
Management fees.
fees, it's some point, what were you thinking on that?
So-
Page 58.
Page 58. We have talked about this every year as part of the budget process. Trying to tie down a better calculation to make sense of this. What we have charged back because of the form of governmental funding that we use, we have the general fund, where most of the operations are charged to, and then you have the standalone enterprise funds of the golf fund and the water fund. Because there are services provided by the general fund, there's essentially like a chargeback. It's kind of like a left pocket, right pocket, that we do for what we call management fees. So payroll services, just general administration services. Historically, the golf club management fee, if you remember, was very high. 1990s, I think, or later than that. And we reached a point where there was actually an interfund loan between the two funds, and the board made the decision to go ahead and forgive that over a 10-year period to free up those reserves for the golf club, with the caveat that the golf club would continue to pay a management services fee to the general fund. Right now, that's been $25,000 for the past few years. What we'd like to do as part of the fee analysis, and it's been on our agenda for a couple of years,
A few years.
is to find a more reasonable way of calculating that. With the understanding that we still have to make it sustainable for the golf club fund and the water fund, but also have a little bit of logic as to where that number's coming from, because right now it's just this arbitrary $5,000.
Right. It's intended to be a general fund offset, honestly. I mean, I think you can look at it as a pointless exercise or as a pointed exercise. And I know we often have the conversation about pockets and whether it's valuable or not. I think the way management fees are used across governments is a means of helping to sustain the general fund at the expense of the enterprise funds. I don't think we've ever used it that way, but I have seen that happen. I think whatever we would end up doing, the intent would also tie into how the long-term debt that is incurred relative to the clubhouse project would be. Would there be abatements if the clubhouse ends up finding, additional resources that would accommodate that and not endanger the enterprise fund? There are a lot of different things and inputs that we would have to talk through, which is to some degree why we really haven't gone through that effort yet, because we know we're right on the precipice of doing something significant at the golf course. So,
And if I may, you all have a lot on your plates. And this is not a simple issue, otherwise it would have been taken care of years ago.
Right.
And I think, I personally would rather have you spending your time on something else. And when you can get around to this, I'll know things are really smooth in the day. Because in the meantime, it literally is left pocket, right pocket, or watch pocket.
Mhm.
It's all one
Yep.
Glencoe.
Yeah. Good question.
All right, if there is nothing else. Anybody else have any questions? And can I get a motion to adjourn?
You adjourn.
Second, all those in favor? Yay. Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.